Welcome to the Fourthstream podcast, where we are dedicated to finding hope. You can count on us to do our research and invite you into a dynamic learning process of authenticity. You can find lots of hopeful resources at fourthstream.com.
Today I want to talk about containers and just the idea of containers. Imagine with me just a box for moving, or a garbage can, or way more sophisticated, like the kinds of containers that shipping is used for, and the things that they stack up on top of ships and of trains. And there are a lot of different ways to transport things and contain things. So I've been thinking about that some, and that reminds me of a passage of Scripture that comments on this container idea. And it's not the only place that it happens, but it certainly happens here. The earth is the Lord's. So this is the picture of the God story. The earth, everything in the world, the earth is the Lord's. Everything that it contains. So there's that idea of containers, and the world and those who dwell in it. So all of the beings belong to God, and all of the entire world. In fact, the world itself is like a huge container. And so I'd like you to think in those terms of the idea of things being made to contain. And because we're made in the image of God, and containers and filling, that seems to be part of what the nature of God is. Again, I'm kind of on a philosophical thread here as well as a faith thread, but that makes me think about the fact that God is a builder, and because God is a builder, we're builders. That's what our nature. I mean, look at the history of the world. Look at one of the first accounts of what happened. You have mankind getting together and building a tower. It's called the Tower of Babel, because we're builders. Because God is a builder, He made us to be builders. He is a builder, and He uses a process, and part of that is He constructs containers, and then He fills those containers with something, which is pretty much how we are. I mean, especially if you look at containers as being broader than just an actual physical container, if you just think about all of the ways that things are contained, like, I go back often to the idea of our DNA strand, and each one of the strands is 6 feet long, and they're folded up, and the amount of information is just beyond my imagination, but it's a container. My body is a container. God makes containers through everything that has been created, and He's a builder, so He's filling things up. That appears to be part of the nature of, as Jordan Peterson would say, of God. Now, when I think about the bigger, sizable God containers, and we've talked some about this, that science is one of them. Science is filled with containers, but it in and of itself is a huge container. It's a container of knowledge. And how amazing is it to see that kind of containment, that kind of information all put together into this huge discipline that goes all the way out into the furthermost reaches of the universe and down into the actual molecule and the basic building blocks of life. So that's a big container. The second one is philosophy and thought. I mean, can you imagine if you could take a container and put all the thoughts that, I'm not just talking about major philosophers, just because somebody gets recorded and recognized in history, that doesn't mean that there haven't been a lot of thinking people over history. And that idea that philosophy and thought are a container that God has created because He made our minds the way that He did. And the idea is that those containers are being filled up. And that's kind of what happens in a lifetime. We take our own containers and then we fill them with the kinds of things that we feel are good and profitable for our lives. So science and knowledge are a huge God container. Philosophy and thought are also a huge God container. Excuse me. And then faith and in our hearts. And I'm not just talking about the physical heart. I'm just talking about the capacity that we have for love and for embracing meaning, all of those different things. And that's a huge container. So we're really kind of surrounded by, right in creation itself, the idea that there are these great big containers. So this is going to be a hard one to get a hold of, but I want you just to think in this direction and see if it helps you at all and encourages you philosophically, faith-wise, and in your scientific view of things. Now, excuse me, without containers, there's no form. There's no holding. So just by nature of, if it rains and there's no place for the rain to fall, and just think of all the containers there are. I mean, you can have everything from a rain barrel or a bucket or whatever. But I'm looking out my window right now, and I'm looking at the trees and the lawn and the rocks that I've put into my landscaping, and I'm looking at all of it, and I'm thinking, man, when it rains, there are all these like mini containers, and you can watch the birds running around and going to those containers after a rain, and they're extracting the water that's gathered in those little places. And without containers, there's no form and there's no holding. So that seems to me to be a part of this whole container conversation. And then together with that, you think about the idea of without water, there's no purpose, there's no life. I mean, we know how important water is for life. We know how much of our bodies are water, like what is it, like 80+%. But without water, there's no purpose because there's no life. You can't have life without liquid. And consequently, empty containers lack meaning. What does a container mean if it doesn't have the water in it? So that's the next part of the imagery that is helpful to me, is that, okay, look at yourself and think about yourself as a container, and then think about the filling that has happened and is happening in your life, and you have been made to contain something. But empty containers lack meaning because again, back to God being a builder, and us being builders as well. We are containers, and we make containers, and we fill them, hopefully with meaning and things that will last. So there are two kinds of liquids that I think about when I think about containers. The first one is that water. And as we just mentioned, water is life, and that relates to science. It also has some philosophical and spiritual ramifications as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But water is life, and you can find it all the way through science. Oil, according to faith, is new life. So water is necessary for life, but oil is necessary for new life. And those are two images that are really clear from the God story. You see them unfolding, and God takes great care in explaining the two aspects of life that come out of water and also oil. And we'll return to that in a little bit and talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about the container. We are created as God containers to hold and then pour out. So let's add that dimension to a container. It's great to have a container, but let's say you have a barrel of water and you put a cover on it, and it just sits there and slowly evaporates over a 10-year period of time or 7-year period of time, not ever exposed to the elements or anything around it. Well, we are created as God containers to hold and then pour out the image of God. We were created in the image of God. The angels weren't created in the image of God. We have been created in the image of God so that we, unlike the other creatures on the face of the earth, we have this imago Deo, this idea that we are in the image of God. So we are containers that are very special. And there's a passage listed here. You can look it up. It's one of Paul's conversations about being containers and pouring out God's image. It's in 2 Corinthians 4. But it appears to me that we were created to be containers, and these containers are not static. In fact, if anything, you get the impression, and you see this a lot when you look at Jesus, being filled and pouring out, being filled and pouring out. That is the nature of not just the scientific part of the container, but also the function of the container. So every container has a purpose, whether you're looking deep in the ground at the reserves of oil and how many years that took to accomplish all of those different things, every container seems to have some kind of purpose. Just like space has a purpose. It's a container. The universe is a container. Now, the God story, or the Bible, is a container as well. It has been put together so that we could know the thoughts of God as it relates to how we fit into the image of God. So the God story, or the Bible, is a container. And as I mentioned before, God's Spirit is the liquid, okay? You have to have water to exist. You have to have the oil of God to be able to come alive and to be able to see and experience truth. So just that image of a container, you got the big containers, and then all the way down to the small containers that we find in science, and then also the idea that we are containers. And that was fascinating for me to just kind of process that and think about it. So now I'm thinking about my container, because I'm always looking in philosophy and science and in faith. I'm looking for meaning and to try to understand meaning. And here's a few things about my container. First of all, the image of God is reflected in a one-of-a-kind me. I'm not a cookie cutter, and even though there are so many billions of human beings on the earth right now, none of us are the same. I mean, we have legs and arms and eyes and all those different things, but we are created uniquely as being one of a kind. And that tells me something about my container. Even though my body is similar, better in some ways and worse than other people around the face of the earth, the image of God is reflected in a one-of-a-kind me. So that's hopeful for me when I think about the purpose of my life. Second of all, imperfection is endemic to humanity. We are born into a world at war. We've talked about this a little bit before. But so we take this container, and my container and your container have been dropped into an imperfect environment. In fact, apart from Adam and Eve, there has been no perfect environment since what happened in the garden. So I am born into a world at war, and I am born into this environment where I'm immediately being shaped by imperfection. Well, the third thing related to that is that through turbulence, I'm shaped and then can be directed into a life of God meaning. So, one of the great questions of life is why? Well, why is because imperfection is a shaping process to bring about things that would never occur apart from imperfection. Okay? Now, what I conclude, and what inevitably you must conclude if you allow yourself to think about it, is that my body and your body container are going to expire. But my soul container is not going to end. It's not going to stop at some point even when my body container wears out and empties out and there's nothing left in it. My soul container will not. And in addition to this, one of the things that the God story teaches us is that our soul is going to receive a new container. I mean, how amazing is this? We experience this environment of imperfection, but we are going to, at the end of our use of this container, we're going to be given a new container, and it's going to be filled with life that is not going to be surrounded by imperfection. That's basically a short definition of heaven in some ways. I know it's more complicated, and that's why I said short. So my container is significant. Now, when I think about my container, and I think about Jesus and water and the oil and life and all those different things, there are two poignant things that I think Jesus, that really struck me. And maybe they're helpful to you, and you're probably familiar with them. In John chapter 4, when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, he is having this conversation, which is really quite remarkable. Here's Jesus mano y fi mano, with one person having this existential and beautiful conversation. Everyone who drinks of this water is going to become thirsty again. So obviously he's pointing at the well that's sitting there. But whoever drinks of the water that I'm going to give him shall never be thirsty. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to life eternal. So Jesus' words explain that this water that goes beyond just the water of life, this is the water of life like on steroids that is able to continue to flow and rehydrate itself, recreate itself. I think that's pretty amazing. The other passage is also found in John. It's just a couple of chapters after the woman at the well. Jesus stands up in Jerusalem and it says on the last day, now on the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood up and he cried out saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and let him drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water." So when you think about your container and you think about your life, there is a supernatural aspect to all of life. All of life is a miracle in many senses. And even though there are scientific parts of that and philosophical parts and faith parts of that, life and water are a miracle in of themselves. And that's pretty amazing. And living water is the connection. So you've got the water that sustains life, but you've got this living water that Jesus has just described to us. It's the connection between the deep part of me and the deep part of God. And I think that's what he was saying in those two passages. And he's saying that the water of God can spring up inside of a human being. And I think this is where I find the supernatural strength for true love and experience true love, because I think this is the water connection. This is a living water. That is different from static water or just the water of purpose that brings life. This is about what we were talking about earlier, when our bodies wear out, what happens when we move beyond that and we are given new containers. And this is where I find true life source. You know, I know there are a lot of philosophies about life source, but I think it's totally found in who God is and how God has created me to be a container for his purposes. So that, you know, for me begs the question, if we need to take in water every day to survive, right? I mean, that's how it works. You have to take in water. How many days can you go? Jesus fasted for 40 days. Other people fast. 40 days is a long time. You know, I think there's a certain threshold where people can't not take in water. But you think about how you feel after 24 hours, and then after 48 hours and 36 hours. Think about how you feel when you haven't taken in water. Life flow is not a one-time process any more than taking in water to survive with my physical body. The same thing is true about the spiritual part of me, the spiritual part of my container. So it's not a one-time process, but it's a filling and a pouring which occurs often, and it even happens daily. So this life flow is being accomplished by God, but also supernaturally by God's Spirit inside of somebody who names the name of Christ and embraces Christ as the true source of life, as well as the ultimate meaning of life as well. So, conclusions. So if this water that Jesus promised is springing up from the inside of us, what is it accomplishing? It seems to be a dynamic process. And so if it is, and if that is indeed happening, I want to be able to pay attention to it. Just like I know when I'm thirsty, I want to know when I am spiritually thirsty. This is one of the great quests of life, because we are so preoccupied with everything, we can't even focus on the fact that we have thirst. And right along with this, in this water word picture, this water comes down from heaven. Jesus gives it, but he brought it from the Father to us, and we're going to talk about where that ends up in a minute. But The idea is that it's also like a life-giving rain that has come down out of heaven, and it waters the earth. It waters all the containers of the earth. Well, that's not just the physical water. It is the containers of the spiritual and the philosophical aspects of who we are as people too. And when this life-giving rain or this living water is given to us and comes down upon us, it does several things. The first thing it does is it nourishes us, because water has life in it. It has minerals and it has elements to it that sustain life. We can't, again, have life without water. Second of all, water, these rains that come down and this living water that springs up from inside of us when we believe that Jesus is God's Son, it cleanses us and washes us, because that's another thing that water does. Is there's anything more beautiful in the spring? Like I'm looking out right now and my windows are kind of dirty because of the winter and the storms and whatever. And is there anything more beautiful than when the spring rains come and start washing things up and making them clean? So this life-giving rain nourishes, it cleanses, but it also refreshes. And so think about what rain does, think about the nature of water, and also think about this living water that's inside of you, because this living water inside of you brings you something that nothing else can bring you. So it nourishes, it cleanses, and it refreshes. And carrying on this water metaphor here, and kind of finishing it off, I'd like to read a passage to you. It's kind of cool. It's out of Revelation 22, and there are all these threads, and we've talked about this a little bit before. There's like 67,000 hyperlinks of all of these things in the God story that you can track, and this is one of the threads. One of the threads that we're looking at today is water. And the liquid of God, as well as just the nature of the life-giving part of physical water. And in Revelation 22, the culmination of this, in the thread, in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God was moving over the expanse, and he was moving over the face of the deep, or the waters of the deep. That's Genesis 1. This is Revelation 22, which is the last mention of water that you're going to find in the Bible, because the Bible is going to be done. So we follow the thread. And here's how it ends, this water thread, or actually, this is how it begins as well as ends. Remember the containers and the new containers. Then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and from the Lamb. Now, there's so much in that we don't have time to talk about now, but we will. In the middle of its street. So he's painting a picture of what this looks like at the end of the age when we move into the new container arena. In the middle of its street, on either side of the river, was a tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So in this picture, you have the water of life, and it's nourishing trees that aren't giving us fruit that we can eat, and just like we would eat fruit now. Apparently, this is for the healing of the nations, and it's a different kind of food. Verse 3, there will no longer, this is in Revelation 22, no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. They will see his face, his name will be on their foreheads. There will no longer be any night. And they will not have a need of the light or the lamp or the light of the sun. Wow, because the Lord God will illumine them. He will be our sun, and they will reign forever and ever. And taking that thread and thinking about that, we start somewhere, it begins somewhere, you started somewhere, you were given this container, and you have this opportunity, and I have this opportunity to fill up and pour out. And fill up and pour out. I believe a life well lived and a satisfying life is a life where you find a satisfied mind, because you can look back at your life and go, I did that. It wasn't perfect. Not everything about my life was perfect, but I saw myself as a container, and I took what I was able to collect and I passed it on to my neighbor, or I passed it on to a poor child in India through my gifts through Compassion International, or through a local ranch in my city, or a radio station that we've gotten to be involved with, where we're able to just be able to talk about the nature of God and of life, and invest that. Because the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and it's, even though it's a small seed, it grows up, and there's this beautiful plant, and in this plant the birds of the air can come and take shelter. And I think that's what my container is for. I have been made to give shelter to the people close to me, maybe even people far away. But most of all, I've been made to be filled as a container to give to the people that God has made me to pour out to. And I just would encourage you in that today. I'm so grateful to have had a number of decades to feel this pouring in and pouring out. And I'm grateful for the water, and I'm also grateful to have encountered the Holy Spirit through my belief in Jesus, because that oil is revealing life to me. So I'm being filled so full by the river of the water of life. And it's a beautiful thing.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can find posts and podcasts on tons of subjects at fourthstream.com, along with encouraging music which can be shared by a variety of ages. Finding hope at fourthstream.com.